In early 1965, the nature of American involvement in Vietnam began to shift in ways that would reshape the conflict entirely. What had been an advisory mission, with thousands of military personnel training and supporting South Vietnamese forces, was evolving into something far more direct and consequential. Planning in Washington now centered on deploying ground combat units to protect American installations scattered across South Vietnam. The change came not through gradual deliberation alone, but through violence that forced decisions forward with sudden urgency. On the 7th of February, Viet Cong forces struck the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Compound, and Camp Holloway at Pleiku in the Central Highlands. American personnel were killed and wounded, helicopters destroyed on their pads, and the sense of vulnerability laid bare for all to see. The attack demonstrated that advisory compounds and air bases were not immune to enemy action. 3 days later, on the 10th of February, another attack came at Quy Nhon along the Central Coast, adding to the toll of American casualties and damaged facilities. These strikes provided the immediate impetus for escalation that many had been contemplating. President Lyndon Johnson authorized a significant increase in military presence, including the deployment of combat troops to Vietnamese soil for the first time. On the 8th of March, 1965, approximately 3,500 United States Marines of the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade came ashore near Da Nang in northern South Vietnam. The landing was orderly and unopposed, more administrative than amphibious assault, yet it marked a threshold crossed. Battalion Landing Team 3 of 9 waded onto Red Beach 2, while Battalion Landing Team 1/3 arrived by helicopter at Da Nang Air Base. These were the first American ground combat troops officially committed to the Vietnam conflict. Their initial mission was limited and defensive in nature, carefully circumscribed by cautious planners in Washington. They were to secure and defend Da Nang Air Base against potential Viet Cong ground attacks. Early orders instructed the Marines not to conduct routine offensive operations against the insurgents, limiting their actions to base security and response to direct threats against American personnel and facilities. By the end of March, Marine strength at Da Nang had grown to almost 5,000 personnel. The base was becoming a major American foothold in the northern reaches of South Vietnam, a place where runways, revetments, and barracks were expanding week by week as construction crews worked through the tropical heat. On the 1st of April, National Security Action Memorandum 328 approved the deployment of 2 additional Marine battalions and authorized an overall increase of 18 to 20,000 men. More significantly, the memorandum changed the American mission from strictly base defense to permit more active use of the troops, opening the door to offensive employment against enemy forces in the surrounding countryside. In April, Marines established another major base area at Chu Lai, roughly 55 miles southeast of Da Nang along the coast. The location was chosen to provide an additional jet-capable airfield and expand the American ground presence in the region. Navy Seabees supported the construction effort with characteristic speed and determination, building runways, revetments, and support facilities for marine aviation and ground units. By mid-1965, Da Nang, Chu Lai, and nearby Phu Bai had become the key Marine Corps base complexes in northern South Vietnam, anchoring American power in what the military designated as I-Corps Tactical Zone. As spring turned to summer, Army units began arriving in increasing numbers, complementing the Marine forces already in place. On the 6th of May, the 173rd Airborne Brigade deployed to South Vietnam, becoming the first major Army combat unit in-country. The paratroopers were initially based at Bien Hoa and other locations near Saigon, tasked with rapid reaction and offensive operations against enemy concentrations wherever they might be found. In July, the 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One, began deploying its brigades with units stationed at bases such as Lai K and Dan northwest of the capital. Elements of the 101st Airborne Division's 1st Brigade deployed near Cam Ranh Bay on the central coast, reinforcing the growing Army presence across the southern and central regions. Cam Ranh Bay was selected as a major deep-water port and logistical hub, its natural harbor offering protected anchorage for supply ships arriving from across the Pacific. Initial construction of port and airfield facilities began in 1965, with civilian contractor RMK BRJ and Army engineer units, including the 497th Port Construction Company, working to build storage areas, fuel systems, and runways capable of handling jet aircraft. The first jet fighters were scheduled to arrive at Cam Ranh Bay Air Base by the 1st of November, prompting accelerated construction efforts that proceeded around the clock. Army-based development plans identified Cam Ranh Bay, Da Nang, Quy Nhon, and other coastal sites as key centers for logistics and support as the ground force expanded to levels unimaginable just months before. In late July, President Johnson announced at a press conference that American troop levels in Vietnam would rise to 125,000, with further increases anticipated as the situation required. He also declared that monthly draft calls would be increased from 17,000 to 35,000 to support the enlarged deployment. The scope of American commitment was growing rapidly, transforming what had been an advisory effort into a major military undertaking that would touch countless American families. General William Westmoreland, commander of the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, advocated substantial increases in ground forces to prevent what he feared would be the collapse of South Vietnam under communist pressure. His mid-1965 estimates proposed that American troops should reach approximately 200,000 by the end of 1966, with further rises in subsequent years. In addition to combat units, 1965 saw a major influx of logistic, signal, engineer, and medical units to support the growing force structure. The infrastructure of war was being built across the country, from airfields to hospitals to ammunition depots hidden behind earthen berms. The Air Force expanded its presence at Da Nang Air Base, using it as a major hub for tactical air support of ground operations and for sorties into North Vietnam under the Rolling Thunder campaign. Airfield expansions included approval of a second 10,000-foot parallel runway to handle increased traffic from American and South Vietnamese aircraft. Navy Seabees also worked at Phu Bai near the ancient city of Hue, laying groundwork for additional aviation facilities. By summer, Marines had expanded their area of operations around Da Nang beyond perimeter defense to include offensive sweeps in surrounding districts, marking the widening combat role that would characterize American involvement. Official American policy statements continued to describe ground troops as assisting South Vietnam in defending its independence rather than replacing Vietnamese forces in the field. Communications emphasized that American soldiers were in Vietnam to protect bases, support the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and counter increased infiltration from the north. The South Vietnamese government generally welcomed the arrival of combat units, viewing them as essential support amid the mounting difficulties facing their own armed forces against an increasingly bold enemy. Rules of engagement in early 1965 limited American ground forces primarily to operations within designated tactical areas of responsibility, coordinated with South Vietnamese units. As the year progressed, American troops increasingly conducted search and destroy missions beyond base perimeters, venturing into the countryside to seek out enemy forces. Naval Construction Force units laid the groundwork for three major advance bases in northern South Vietnam, building roads, storage areas, fuel systems, and living quarters to support the expanding formations of Marines and soldiers. The overall American troop presence in Vietnam grew from about 23,000 at the end of 1964 to approximately 184,000 by the end of 1965. Major combat units now included multiple Marine regiments, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, elements of the 1st Infantry Division, and other Army brigades spread across the country from the demilitarized zone to the Mekong Delta. Army historians would later refer to 1965 through 1967 as the build-up years, with 1965 marking the decisive transition from an advisory effort to large-scale ground combat presence. Throughout this transformation, the Johnson administration did not seek a formal declaration of war from Congress. Instead, it relied on the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin Resolution as legal authority for the troop buildup, a resolution passed after reported attacks on American destroyers. Public statements described American actions as fulfilling treaty and moral commitments to resist communist aggression in Southeast Asia. By the end of 1965, American forces had established a network of large bases and logistical hubs along the coast and near major population centers, positioning themselves for expanded operations in the coming year. Operation Rolling Thunder was a sustained American aerial bombing campaign against North Vietnam conducted between early March 1965 and early November 1968. It represented the first major sustained American air offensive of the war, an effort that would drop more bombs than had fallen in any previous conflict. President Lyndon B. Johnson approved the operation on the 13th of February 1965, setting in motion a campaign that would stretch across more than 3 years and reshape the nature of aerial warfare forever. The first Rolling Thunder strike missions were flown on the 2nd of March 1965 by United States Air Force, United States Navy, and Republic of Vietnam Air Force aircraft. The campaign replaced earlier, more limited reprisal strikes and marked the beginning of sustained American air operations against North Vietnamese territory. One stated objective was to pressure North Vietnam's leadership to stop their support for the insurgency in South Vietnam. Another was to raise morale in the South by demonstrating American willingness to act forcefully against the enemy's homeland. Planners also hoped that bombing would reduce North Vietnam's capacity to wage war by destroying transportation routes, supply depots, and industrial targets scattered across the country. Rolling Thunder was managed as a policy of gradual escalation, with target lists expanded over time rather than delivered in a single concentrated strike campaign. Target selection was tightly controlled by the White House and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, often through weekly review sessions that became known informally as Tuesday lunches. This level of civilian control over military operations was unprecedented in American history. An early Joint Chiefs of Staff proposal had recommended a 94 target list focusing on key military and logistic nodes, but the administration adopted a more limited and phased approach, expanding the target set incrementally as the campaign progressed. The initial phase of Rolling Thunder focused on targets just north of the demilitarized zone, including supply depots, barracks, and infiltration routes that fed men and material into the south. At first, American aircraft were prohibited from striking targets in or near Hanoi, Haiphong, and along the Chinese border to avoid provoking China or the Soviet Union into more direct involvement. Early rules of engagement also restricted attacks on major dikes, populated urban centers, and certain industrial facilities that might cause civilian casualties or diplomatic complications. On the 29th of June, 1965, Johnson authorized strikes against North Vietnamese petroleum, oil, and lubricants storage sites, including facilities near Hanoi and Haiphong. The POL strikes were intended to disrupt North Vietnam's fuel supplies and thereby hinder military transport and operations throughout the country. Despite these attacks, North Vietnam adapted by dispersing fuel storage into smaller, concealed sites and using alternative supply routes that proved difficult to interdict from the air. Rolling Thunder targets over time came to include roads, rail lines, bridges, truck parks, storage depots, barracks, radar sites, and anti-aircraft positions. The geography of North Vietnam meant that much of its logistics flowed through a limited number of routes and choke points, making these targets attractive but also heavily defended. Air Force aircraft operated primarily from bases in South Vietnam and Thailand, including Da Nang, Korat, Tok Ly, and Ubon. Navy aircraft carriers such as Ticonderoga and Constellation flew sorties from Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin, launching strikes day and night against targets across the north. The campaign was frequently interrupted by bombing pauses ordered by Washington in hopes of inducing North Vietnam to negotiate. There were at least 7 significant bombing halts or reductions during Rolling Thunder, including a major pause from December 1965 to January 1966. North Vietnam did not agree to scale back its support for the Southern insurgency during these pauses, and full bombing resumed after each break as American frustration with the lack of diplomatic progress grew. When Rolling Thunder began, North Vietnam's air defenses consisted mainly of small-caliber anti-aircraft guns and limited radar coverage. By 1966 and 1967, Soviet and Chinese assistance had enabled North Vietnam to build a dense, integrated air defense network that became among the most formidable in the world. The system eventually included thousands of anti-aircraft artillery pieces, SA-2 surface-to-air missile sites, and MiG fighter aircraft, all coordinated by an increasingly sophisticated radar network. By 1967, North Vietnam had an estimated 150 SA-2 missile launchers organized in more than 25 battalions, rotating around roughly 150 prepared sites. American aircraft losses over North Vietnam increased as missiles and fighters became more effective, even though conventional anti-aircraft artillery remained the single largest cause of losses. In 1967 alone, American forces lost about 248 aircraft to enemy action over North Vietnam, including 145 Air Force and 102 Navy aircraft. American tactics evolved to counter these defenses. Wild Weasel missions using radar homing missiles, such as the AGM-45 Shrike, became a standard part of strike packages, tasked with suppressing enemy air defenses before and during bombing runs. North Vietnamese operators adapted in turn, occasionally turning off radar or using passive guidance modes to reduce the effectiveness of American anti-radiation missiles. Strike packages typically included bomb-carrying aircraft plus escort fighters for MiG combat air patrol and surface-to-air missile suppression elements, reducing the number of aircraft actually available for delivering ordnance on targets. Rules of engagement initially forbade attacks on MiG airfields and some missile sites unless they had first fired on American aircraft, limiting preemptive strikes against the air defense system. These restrictions frustrated military commanders who argued they allowed the enemy to strengthen his defenses while American pilots paid the price. A 1966 memorandum from McNamara argued that bombing North Vietnam was unlikely to stop infiltration because supplies could be interdicted at multiple points south of the 17th parallel as well, questioning the fundamental logic of the campaign. By late 1967, Rolling Thunder had become the largest air campaign in American history to that date in terms of tonnage of ordnance dropped. Between March 1965 and November 1968, Air Force aircraft flew approximately 153,000 attack sorties against North Vietnam. Navy and Marine Corps aircraft flew about 152,000 additional attack sorties over the same period. On the 31st of December 1967, the Department of Defense announced that about 864,000 tons of bombs had been dropped on North Vietnam during Rolling Thunder. This tonnage exceeded the 653,000 tons dropped during the Korean War and the 503,000 tons dropped in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. Throughout the campaign, target approval for areas near Hanoi, Haiphong, and the Chinese border remained subject to high-level political review in Washington. The route package system divided North Vietnam into geographic sectors, each assigned to specific American services to coordinate air operations and prevent duplication of effort. Rolling Thunder strikes were concentrated mainly in the southern and central parts of North Vietnam, with more restrictive rules governing operations in the populated Red River Delta region around the capital. North Vietnam responded to the bombing by dispersing industry, decentralizing logistics, and increasing use of manual labor to repair damaged roads and bridges. Work crews filled craters and rebuilt structures, sometimes within hours of attacks, demonstrating a resilience that American planners had not fully anticipated. Soviet and Chinese aid to North Vietnam increased during Rolling Thunder, including delivery of air defense equipment, engineering support, and logistical supplies that offset much of the damage inflicted. Internal American evaluations during 1966 and 1967 were mixed, with some military leaders wanting fewer restrictions and more aggressive targeting, while others, including McNamara himself, questioned the campaign's strategic payoff. A 1967 Pentagon Systems Analysis study concluded that Rolling Thunder had not significantly reduced the flow of men and material into South Vietnam. President Johnson ordered a partial bombing halt above the 20th parallel on the 31st of March, 1968, as part of a new initiative to open negotiations with North Vietnam. The bombing of the remainder of the North under Rolling Thunder ended on the 2nd of November, 1968, just before the American presidential election. In total, Rolling Thunder represented a major escalation of American involvement, linking air operations directly to attempts to influence North Vietnam's political decisions and war-making capacity. Whether it achieved its objectives or merely prolonged the conflict remains debated by historians and military analysts to this day. The Battle of Drang took place in the central highlands of South Vietnam near the Cambodian border, primarily between the 14th and 18th of November 1965. It was the first major battle between United States regular forces and North Vietnamese Army regular units during the Vietnam War. For the Americans, it would serve as both a proving ground for new tactics and a brutal introduction to the kind of war they had entered. For the North Vietnamese, it offered lessons they would apply for years to come. The name Drang came from the river that flowed through the valley, a remote and sparsely populated region of elephant grass, scrub jungle, and rolling terrain that seemed far from anywhere. The battle involved elements of the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile, the 1st Division organized and equipped specifically for large-scale helicopter warfare. This formation had been activated in 1965 and deployed to Vietnam to test the concept of rapid airmobile operations in difficult terrain. American commanders saw the Drang Valley area as an ideal location to test air mobility because of its sparse road network and rugged terrain. factors that would typically limit conventional military operations, but might favor helicopter-borne forces that could leap over obstacles and arrive where the enemy least expected them. The battle is commonly divided into two main engagements around helicopter landing zones, designated X-Ray and Albany in the Drang Valley. Landing Zone X-Ray. The first major engagement took place from the 14th to 16th of November at the base of the Chu Pong Massif, a mountain range that straddled the border with Cambodia. Landing Zone Albany. A second engagement involving different battalions of the same American regiment occurred on the 17th of November north of X-Ray. The battle followed the siege and relief of Plai Mi, a special forces camp that had been attacked by North Vietnamese forces in late October. After that engagement, General William Westmoreland ordered the 1st Cavalry Division to pursue the withdrawing enemy forces in Pleiku Province. The North Vietnamese units engaged at Ia Drang included elements of the 32nd, 33rd, and 66th Regiments of the B3 Front, all part of the North Vietnamese Regular Army that had infiltrated into the south through jungle trails. The American main unit at Landing Zone X-Ray was the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Harold G. Moore. Supporting units included the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, and elements of the 1st Battalion, 9th Cavalry. At Landing Zone Albany, the principal American units were the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and elements of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, which were moving on foot from X-Ray when they were engaged by North Vietnamese forces. On the 14th of November, the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry was inserted into Landing Zone X-Ray by UH-1 helicopter lifts from Plai Mi and other bases, marking one of the first battalion-size air assaults of the war. Helicopters ferried troops into X-Ray in serials over several hours, demonstrating that a full battalion could be brought into a remote area without road access. This was precisely what the airmobile concept was designed to accomplish. Because heavy artillery and armored vehicles could not accompany the airmobile battalion into the landing zone, fire support had to come from distant artillery bases and close air support. American artillery batteries located at Plai Mi and other fire bases provided indirect fire in support of the troops at X-Ray. Close air support included attacks by A-1 Sky Raiders and other aircraft coordinated by forward air controllers and ground observers who marked targets and adjusted fires in real time amid the chaos of battle. Helicopters were used not only for troop insertion but also for medical evacuation, ammunition resupply, and reinforcement throughout the battle. The wounded were flown out quickly, a capability that would become a hallmark of American operations in Vietnam. The initial American mission at X-Ray was to find and engage North Vietnamese units believed to be assembling near the Chu Pong Massif. Upon landing, the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry made contact with enemy forces in the vicinity, leading to intense combat over the next 2 days. Additional companies from the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry were airlifted into X-Ray during the 14th and 15th of November to reinforce Moore's battalion as fighting intensified. American commanders at division level considered using B-52 arc light strikes near Ia Drang and coordinated such strikes around the battle area to interdict enemy reinforcements and escape routes. After heavy fighting, American forces at X-Ray remained in control of the landing zone, and North Vietnamese units gradually withdrew toward the Cambodian border. On the 16th of November, the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry began to be extracted by helicopter from X-Ray, while other battalions remained to secure the area temporarily. The engagement had validated many aspects of airmobile doctrine, but the battle was not yet over. The following day, the 17th of November, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and elements of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry marched from X-Ray toward landing zone, Albany, as part of a larger maneuver. During the movement, they encountered North Vietnamese forces concentrated in the area, leading to a severe engagement around the landing zone. Air support at Albany, including A-1 Skyraider strikes, again played a major role in supporting American units engaged in difficult conditions. Fighting in the Drang campaign formally subsided by the 18th and 19th of November, although smaller contacts continued in the Central Highlands afterward. American official figures for the broader Drang campaign reported 234 Americans killed and 242 wounded in the X-Ray and Albany actions combined. American estimates of North Vietnamese losses varied, with commonly cited figures ranging from about 1,800 to more than 2,000 killed. The Department of Defense later noted that the ratio of enemy bodies to weapons recovered at Drang was higher than the typical 3 or 4 to 1 found elsewhere, suggesting that some of those counted may have been support personnel or that weapons were carried away during the retreat. General Westmoreland and the operations staff at Military Assistance Command Vietnam analyzed Drang data and calculated a kill ratio of roughly 10 to 12 North Vietnamese for every American soldier killed. Westmoreland interpreted these ratios as evidence that American firepower and airmobile tactics could attrit enemy forces over time. Drang reinforced his belief in a strategy of attrition, aiming to bleed enemy units faster than they could be replaced through recruitment and infiltration from the north. American Army doctrinal writers cited Drang as validation of the airmobile concept, showing that helicopter-borne infantry could rapidly engage main force enemy units in terrain that would otherwise be inaccessible. The battle demonstrated that helicopters could insert and sustain battalion-sized forces in remote areas, but also highlighted their vulnerability on and near landing zones when the enemy was present in strength. Drang underscored the importance of closely integrated artillery and air support in protecting airmobile units operating far from ground supply lines. American after-action reports noted command and control challenges in coordinating dispersed air, artillery, and ground elements during intense engagements. The chaos of battle revealed gaps between doctrine and practice that would require further refinement. From the North Vietnamese perspective, Drang showed that close-quarters engagement could partially offset American advantages in artillery and air power. North Vietnamese assessments concluded that drawing American units into close combat near their positions limited the effectiveness of the firepower that had proven so devastating at range. Both sides used Drang as a case study. The Americans refined their airmobile doctrine and combined arms coordination, while the North Vietnamese adapted tactics for fighting heavily supported American units. The Drang campaign became a key reference in American professional military education on airmobile operations for years afterward. For the remainder of 1965, the 1st Cavalry Division continued operations in the Central Highlands, building on lessons from Drang about landing zone selection and force buildup. Subsequent American tactics placed increased emphasis on securing landing zones, rapid reinforcement, and establishing strong defensive perimeters during air assaults. Drang also influenced North Vietnamese operational planning, encouraging greater attention to ambushes of moving airmobile units, as had occurred at Albany. The battle's significance in 1965 lay in demonstrating that both American and North Vietnamese regular forces were prepared to fight large, multi-day engagements. This was not a guerrilla war of hit-and-run ambushes, but a conflict where main force units would clash in sustained combat. The shape of the war to come was now visible in the jungle clearings and elephant grass of the Drang Valley, a harbinger of battles yet to be fought. In 1965, American strategy under General William Westmoreland shifted toward a war of attrition, emphasizing large search and destroy operations against main force Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army units. Search and destroy was defined in doctrinal discussions as operations to locate enemy forces, fix them in place, and destroy them with superior firepower. The concept contrasted with clear and hold or enclave strategies, which focused on securing populated areas and maintaining continuous presence to protect the people from insurgent influence. It was a strategy built on the assumption that American firepower and mobility could grind down the enemy faster than he could replace his losses through recruitment and infiltration from the north. Search and destroy missions typically involved battalion or brigade-sized forces sweeping through designated areas for limited periods before returning to base. American Army search and destroy operations relied heavily on helicopters to insert infantry into landing zones near suspected enemy positions, allowing forces to bypass difficult terrain and strike where the enemy least expected them. Artillery support was provided from fire support bases established in forward areas with pre-planned and on-call fires to cover likely enemy approaches and landing zones. Tactical air support, including fighter bombers and gunships, was routinely integrated into these operations for close air support and interdiction of enemy movement along trails and roads through the jungle. Westmoreland's headquarters used body count, the number of enemy reported killed, as the primary quantitative indicator of success in search and destroy missions. The 1967 Combined Campaign Plan directed American and South Vietnamese forces to attrit Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces at a rate as high as their capability to put men in the field. Briefings often compared the rolling estimate of enemy killed in action to estimated enemy recruitment and infiltration to show what planners hoped was a favorable attrition balance. Higher headquarters also tracked weapons captured, prisoners taken, bunkers destroyed, and rice seized as secondary metrics of operational effectiveness that might demonstrate progress in the war effort. South Vietnamese forces conducted their own search and destroy operations, sometimes in coordination with American units, though they were also tasked with territorial security and pacification duties that demanded their attention elsewhere in the countryside. Typical American search and destroy task forces combined infantry battalions with armored cavalry or mechanized units, artillery batteries, engineers, and aviation assets in carefully orchestrated combined arms teams. Operations were generally planned using intelligence from aerial reconnaissance, captured documents, informers, and radio intercepts to identify suspected base areas where the enemy might be concentrated in sufficient numbers to justify the commitment of major forces. Once contact was made with the enemy, Doctrine called for maneuvering to fix enemy units in place and then using artillery and airstrikes to inflict heavy losses while friendly infantry closed for the kill. These missions often lasted from several days to a few weeks, after which American units were redeployed to new areas of operation, leaving the cleared territory without a permanent presence that might prevent the enemy from returning once the sweep had passed. Operation Starlight in August 1965, conducted by Marines near Chu Lai, is widely cited as an early large-scale search and destroy operation that set the pattern for those that followed. The operation involved about 5,500 Marines in a combined helicopter-borne and amphibious assault against the 1st Viet Cong Regiment south of the Chu Lai base. It demonstrated that American forces could bring overwhelming firepower to bear on enemy concentrations when contact was made and when the enemy chose to stand and fight rather than slip away into the jungle. Operation Masher, later renamed White Wing, ran from January through March 1966 in Binh Dinh province along the central coast of South Vietnam. Multiple American and South Vietnamese units swept through a major Viet Cong stronghold, producing large reported enemy body counts and significant numbers of civilians displaced from their homes and villages. The name Masher was changed at President Johnson's request because it sounded too violent for public consumption, a sign of the sensitivities that would increasingly shape how the war was presented to American audiences back home who were growing more attentive to news from Vietnam. Operation Attleboro from September through November 1966 in Tay Ninh province began as a brigade operation and expanded to involve multiple American divisions as contact with enemy forces intensified unexpectedly. Attleboro featured extensive use of helicopter air assaults and large-scale employment of artillery and tactical air power against Viet Cong base areas in War Zone C near the Cambodian border, where the enemy maintained extensive supply caches, training facilities, and rest areas beyond easy reach of South Vietnamese forces. Operation Cedar Falls from the 8th to 26th of January 1967 was a major search and destroy operation targeting the Iron Triangle northwest of Saigon, a base area that had supported insurgent operations against the capital for years. About 16,000 American troops and 14,000 South Vietnamese troops participated in coordinated sweeps, cordon operations, and demolition of bunkers and tunnels. Allied forces reported capturing 590 individual weapons, 23 crew-served weapons, and over 2,800 explosive items, and destroying extensive tunnel networks that had sheltered enemy forces for years. Cedar Falls also resulted in the seizure of roughly 3,700 tons of rice, which American sources calculated could feed 5 enemy regiments for a full year. Operation Junction City from late February through mid-May 1967 in Tay Ninh province was one of the largest American search and destroy operations of the entire war, aimed at War Zone C and the Central Office for South Vietnam. The enemy's southern headquarters believed to be hidden somewhere in that jungle-covered border region. Junction City involved more than 25 American battalions at its peak, plus South Vietnamese units using both parachute drops and helicopter air assaults to seal off the area and then sweep through it systematically. The operation included the only American Army airborne combat jump of the Vietnam War by elements of the 173rd Airborne Brigade on the 22nd of February 1967. Post-operation summaries emphasized reported body counts, weapons captured, and destroyed base camps as key indicators of success in achieving the operation's objectives. Westmoreland's staff developed large multi-division search and destroy campaigns, partly to draw North Vietnamese and Viet Cong main forces into battle and away from populated areas where they threatened pacification efforts. Combined campaign plans for 1966 and 1967 assigned American forces primary responsibility for offensive operations against main force units, with South Vietnamese forces to focus more on pacification and territorial security. American Doctrine explicitly separated search and destroy from pacification, creating organizational tensions between large offensive sweeps and village-level security programs. Helicopter air mobility was central to search and destroy, allowing battalions to be shifted quickly between areas and inserted near suspected enemy concentrations. Fire support bases were established in forward areas to extend artillery coverage, often moving repeatedly to support successive operations. Intelligence reports sometimes noted that enemy main forces avoided decisive engagement by slipping away before or during sweeps. The body count controversy arose partly because operational success was tied to high reported casualties, creating incentives to over-report. Some commanders expressed concern that search and destroy operations created refugees and damaged rural areas, complicating pacification. Despite criticisms, Westmoreland's headquarters continued to regard search and destroy as the principal method for engaging enemy main forces through 1967. By year's end, American and South Vietnamese forces had conducted thousands of named and unnamed search and destroy operations across South Vietnam. Contemporary briefings and public statements frequently highlighted aggregate enemy killed in action figures from these operations as evidence of progress in the war. At the same time, some analysts inside the Defense Department by late 1967 questioned whether high body counts from search and destroy missions were translating into strategic gains. The enemy seemed able to replace losses and continue fighting, raising questions about whether attrition alone could win the war. Marine Corps units in I Corps often favored combined action programs emphasizing local security rather than large sweeps, reflecting service doctrinal differences. Internal debates in Washington and Saigon contrasted Westmoreland's attrition-focused strategy with proposals for smaller-scale clear and hold approaches that might provide more lasting security for the rural population. CAA reports suggested that large-scale sweeps sometimes undermined efforts to gain the trust of rural populations. The strategy that would dominate American operations until 1968 had proven its ability to inflict casualties, but whether it could achieve ultimate victory remained an open question. Between 1965 and 1967, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army forces combined guerrilla and conventional tactics to counter expanding American and South Vietnamese operations. They were fighting an enemy with overwhelming firepower, complete air superiority, and technology they could not match. Their response was adaptation, learning from each engagement and developing methods to neutralize American advantages while exploiting their weaknesses. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese units increasingly avoided prolonged set-piece battles, seeking instead to strike quickly and withdraw before American firepower could be fully brought to bear. One core adaptation was to close in on American units at short range, reducing the effectiveness of artillery and air support in what became known as hugging tactics. When fighting at close quarters, the risk of friendly fire made American commanders hesitant to call in the massive bombardments that might otherwise devastate enemy positions. Communist forces studied American helicopter movement patterns and tried to anticipate likely landing zones based on terrain and prior operations. Where time allowed, they prepared ambushes and kill zones around probable landing zones to attack airmobile units as they touched down, when soldiers were most vulnerable and before they could establish defensive positions. Fighters learned to use the sound and flight paths of helicopters to estimate landing directions and adjust their defensive positions accordingly. Pre-built trench and bunker systems around key base areas enabled Viet Cong and North Vietnamese units to withstand initial bombardment and remain in position to fight or withdraw as the situation demanded. These positions were often constructed with overhead cover, thick enough to resist all but direct hits from heavy ordnance. Communist forces made extensive use of booby traps and mines along trails, rice paddy dikes, and likely American movement routes. Army histories note that the Viet Cong used nuisance mining, scattering mines in irregular patterns rather than in formal minefields that could be detected and cleared systematically. These mines were often laid at night by personnel with detailed knowledge of local terrain, aiming to hinder vehicle movement and off-road maneuver. Mines and booby traps served as a substitute for artillery, inflicting casualties, damaging vehicles, and slowing Allied operations. The psychological effect of potential mines forced American units to devote significant time daily to road clearing and route security, diverting resources from offensive operations. Communist forces exploited predictable American patterns, such as repeated use of certain trails or approaches during search and destroy sweeps. They made deliberate efforts to attack American support facilities such as radar stations, depots, and airfields to weaken air power at its source. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong commanders encouraged operations against isolated outposts and bases that could be overrun quickly before major American reinforcements arrived by helicopter. Logistics adapted by dispersing supply caches into smaller, concealed stocks rather than large depots, vulnerable to airstrikes. Supply networks used foot porters, bicycles, and small boats, allowing movement at night or under canopy to avoid detection by reconnaissance aircraft. The North Vietnamese transport organization known as Group 559 continued to expand the Ho Chi Minh Trail, adding bypasses and alternate routes to reduce vulnerability to bombing. In the south, rear service units established hidden way stations and medical points in dense jungle and border sanctuaries where wounded fighters could recover away from the fighting. The Cu Chi and Iron Triangle tunnel systems north and west of Saigon were expanded into extensive underground networks during this period. These tunnels, located in old alluvium soils, were typically dug 1.5 to 20 meters deep, providing dry, relatively stable underground spaces protected from the elements and from enemy detection. The Cu Chi tunnel network is estimated to have extended for hundreds of kilometers, connecting fighting positions, storage areas, living quarters, and medical facilities. Tunnel complexes enabled Viet Cong units to move between positions, store weapons and food, and shelter from artillery and bombing. The systems were integrated with surface jungle cover, making entrances difficult to detect even when American forces were standing directly above them. The tunnel networks linked to the Saigon River and broader logistics routes, facilitating movement of supplies from the Ho Chi Minh Trail into the three core tactical zone surrounding the capital. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese sappers developed specialized techniques for attacking fortified bases and airfields, often using infiltration at night to penetrate perimeters before launching their assaults. North Vietnamese training emphasized camouflage, deception, and concealment to defeat American aerial reconnaissance and forward observers. Forces took advantage of dense jungle, broken terrain, and tall vegetation to mask movement and positions from ground and air observation. Units were instructed to disperse quickly after firing to avoid concentrated artillery or airstrikes that could devastate a position if fighters remained stationary too long. When American aircraft used smoke to mark targets, some communist units learned to anticipate strikes and evacuate before bombs arrived. Fighters also studied American color-coded smoke signals and in some cases imitated them to deceive or confuse pilots and ground forces, misdirecting airstrikes away from their actual positions. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong doctrine stressed attacking American and South Vietnamese units on the move, especially the tails of columns and relief forces, rather than attacking main bases directly where defenses were strongest. Ambush operations were planned to exploit narrow roads, canal banks, and river crossings, where maneuver options for American forces were limited and firepower could not be easily brought to bear. Communist units often employed L-shaped and linear ambushes, combining small arms, machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades with mines or command-detonated charges to maximize casualties in the opening moments of contact. Planners increased use of coordinated attacks on local outposts and district towns to stretch South Vietnamese forces thin and prevent them from concentrating against any single threat. Local force and guerrilla units were tasked with tying down territorial forces and supporting main force operations by cutting roads and harassing outposts, creating distractions that diverted attention from larger operations elsewhere. North Vietnamese main force units tended to operate from base camps close to borders with Laos and Cambodia, allowing them to step across boundaries to avoid sustained pursuit by American forces that were prohibited from following. By 1966, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese organization typically divided manpower into main forces, local forces, guerrillas, rear services, and political cadres, each with specific roles in the overall effort. Main force regiments were used to attack larger American and South Vietnamese units, while local forces handled ambushes, security, and support functions in specific districts where they knew the terrain intimately. Political cadres and village-level activists emphasized intelligence gathering, maintaining informant networks to track Allied movements and provide early warning of operations. Captured documents and interrogations revealed that Communist units carefully debriefed after engagements to analyze American tactics and adjust their own procedures accordingly. Leadership issued regular directives, summarizing lessons learned and distributing them to units across different regions, so that successful adaptations could be replicated throughout the force. As American search and destroy operations intensified, Communist forces placed greater emphasis on preserving combat strength rather than holding fixed terrain that could be recovered later. Their strategy continued to prioritize protracted war, accepting temporary losses of base areas while focusing on long-term attrition of American and South Vietnamese forces. Political work among the rural population remained a central component of adaptation, aiming to sustain recruitment and logistical support despite displacement and bombing. Propaganda portrayed American large unit operations as destructive and used resulting dislocation to recruit among displaced villagers who blamed their suffering on the foreign presence. In coastal and riverine regions, Communist forces adapted to growing American and South Vietnamese naval activity by using smaller boats at night and shifting some movement inland to avoid patrol craft. They also increased the use of underwater obstacles, mines, and concealed firing points along waterways to challenge Allied patrol boats operating on the rivers and canals. By 1967, American analyses acknowledged that Communist flexibility in shifting between guerrilla and regular warfare made it difficult to force decisive battles that might end the war quickly. Overall, adaptations in tactics, organization, and underground infrastructure allowed Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces to continue effective resistance despite escalating American firepower in 1965 through 1967. They had studied their enemy, learned from their losses, and developed methods that would sustain their struggle for years to come. Between 1965 and 1967, pacification in South Vietnam referred to efforts to extend government control and win rural support through combined security and development measures. American hearts and minds concepts emphasized hold and protect of rural populations in contrast to the primarily offensive search and destroy strategy. The challenge was to bring security, services, and allegiance to the government into villages and hamlets that had for years lived under contested authority or outright Viet Cong control. South Vietnamese pacification efforts in the mid-1960s evolved through several programs, including rural construction, rural reconstruction, Chien Thang, meaning struggle for victory, and revolutionary development. The Chien Thang program, created in 1965, focused on assessing hamlet security and development as part of pacification planning. Hop Tak, meaning victory, was a Saigon area pacification program begun earlier and continued into the mid-1960s, aiming to expand secure zones around the capital through concentrated resources and systematic clearing of Viet Cong influence. HOP-TAC concentrated military forces, police, and American advisors on priority districts around Saigon to clear communist influence and build local administration. Revolutionary Development, adopted in 1966, provided the main framework for South Vietnamese rural pacification and political mobilization in the countryside. Revolutionary Development cadre teams generally consisted of about 59 South Vietnamese personnel trained in political education, local security, and rural development tasks at the Van Cap National Training Center. The typical Revolutionary Development cadre mission was to move into a hamlet for several months, help organize local self-defense, and promote support for the Saigon government through visible improvements in daily life. Activities included forming village committees, organizing hamlet elections, conducting propaganda meetings, and supporting small infrastructure projects such as wells, schools, and roads. Pacification planners emphasized the need to coordinate cadre teams with regional forces, popular forces, and national police for security that would allow development programs to take root. The regional forces and popular forces militia system, composed of locally recruited part-time soldiers, was expanded during 1965 through 1967 to provide static security for hamlets and villages across the countryside. Regional force units typically operated at district or province level, while popular forces platoons were tied to individual villages or clusters of hamlets where the men knew the terrain and people intimately. American support to these forces included weapons, training, advisory teams, and in some cases direct participation in combined operations against local Viet Cong elements. The Marine Corps developed the Combined Action Program in 1965 as a locally focused pacification and security initiative that embodied a different philosophy from large unit operations. The first Combined Action Unit began operations on the 3rd of August 1965 near Phu Bai, combining a Marine rifle squad with a popular forces platoon in a village setting. A standard combined action platoon consisted of about 13 Marines, a Navy corpsman, and 30 to 40 popular forces militia, living in or adjacent to the village they protected rather than returning to a large base each night. Combined action objectives included destroying Viet Cong infrastructure in the hamlet, organizing local intelligence networks, protecting public security, and participating in civic action projects that improved daily life. In 1967, the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force Commander, Lieutenant General Lewis Walt, formally expanded the program and appointed Lieutenant Colonel William Corson as Deputy Director for Combined Action. Units undertook joint patrols, ambushes, and local defense, while also assisting with small projects such as well digging and school repairs that demonstrated the government's commitment to rural welfare. American civic action activities in rural areas included construction or repair of roads, bridges, schools, medical clinics, and wells that had fallen into disrepair during years of war. Military civil affairs units provided medical outreach known as MedCap, dental visits, and basic veterinary services to rural populations as part of Hearts and Minds' efforts to win support away from the insurgents. The Chu Hoi program, meaning open arms, active throughout 1965 through 1967, offered amnesty and resettlement assistance to Viet Cong and North Vietnamese defectors who chose to abandon the communist cause. Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, known by its acronym CORDS, was created on the 9th of May 1967 to unify American military and civilian pacification efforts under the Military Assistance Command Vietnam. Accords integrated military command structures with civilian agencies such as the Agency for International Development and the Central Intelligence Agency for pacification planning and execution. Robert W. Comer, a White House advisor known for his aggressive management style, became the first deputy commander of MiG-V for Accords, overseeing American support to pacification across the country. Comer argued that pacification required three integrated tasks: security to protect the population, destruction of Viet Cong infrastructure that maintained communist control, and programs to win rural hearts and minds through development and services. Accords operated at multiple levels, with American advisors assigned down to province and district teams to work with South Vietnamese officials on pacification programs. By late 1967, Accords had been extended to all 44 provinces of South Vietnam, creating a unified structure where none had existed before. Under Accords, the regional forces and popular forces expanded from about 300,000 in 1967, with improvements in training and equipment supported by American advisors. Accords also supported expansion of the National Police, which grew from roughly 60,000 to 80,000 personnel over subsequent years to provide local security and intelligence gathering. Pacification metrics included the number of secure or relatively secure hamlets, often expressed as a percentage of the rural population under government control. Statistical frameworks such as the Hamlet Evaluation System quantified security, political, and social indicators for each hamlet on monthly scorecards that could be aggregated and analyzed. The system used categories ranging from A for secure to E for Viet Cong controlled, based on criteria including security incidents, presence of government services, and communist activity. By mid-1967, American and South Vietnamese statistics often reported that 60 to 70% of the population lived in hamlets rated secure or relatively secure, though methodologies were debated. Pacification plans frequently linked security upgrades to development projects, such as building schools once hamlets reached specific security ratings that suggested communist influence had been pushed out. Studies distinguished between hamlet security, meaning absence of Viet Cong coercion, and hamlet development, meaning provision of basic services and infrastructure that improved daily life. Reports identified corruption, weak local administration, and lack of trained civil servants as recurring obstacles to pacification that undermined even well-designed programs. Some pacification programs suffered from inadequate coordination with large-scale search and destroy operations, which could disrupt rural communities and create refugees even as cadre teams worked to build loyalty. Evaluations from 1966 through 1967 often noted better progress in pacification in areas with strong local leadership and consistent advisor presence that maintained momentum over time. By late 1967, Comer and Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker were pressing the South Vietnamese government to accelerate pacification and replace ineffective provincial officials who hindered progress. American and South Vietnamese leaders viewed pacification gains as essential to complement Rolling Thunder and large unit operations by consolidating control in the countryside after enemy main forces had been pushed away. Despite organizational reforms under Accords, pacification programs in 1965 through 1967 continued to face challenges from Viet Cong intimidation, ongoing fighting, and population displacement that made lasting progress difficult to achieve. Contemporary assessments described pacification as uneven, with some provinces showing significant improvements while others lagged due to security or administrative problems that defied easy solutions. Modernization-oriented pacification planning emphasized land reform, agricultural extension, and creation of rural cooperatives where security conditions allowed such development efforts to take hold. Johnson administration documents framed pacification as a key component of a broader modernization strategy for South Vietnam's countryside. Some American Army units experimented with combined action or village outpost concepts outside the Marine Corps, though these remain limited compared with the Marine Combined Action Program. Official pacification reports differentiated between contested, under government influence, and under Viet Cong influence hamlets, reflecting gradations rather than a simple secure or insecure dichotomy. The struggle for rural allegiance would continue alongside the military war, two parallel conflicts that were interconnected yet often pursued through different methods and measures of success. During 1965 through 1967, most American Army enlisted soldiers in Vietnam served one-year tours, while most Marines served 13-month tours. Officers generally served 1 year as well, with only part of that time spent in field command and the remainder in staff or support roles where experience could be passed on to the next rotation. The individual rotation policy meant that replacements often joined units already in combat rather than deploying with a cohesive unit formed stateside. Soldiers arrived alone and departed alone, their time in Vietnam measured by a calendar that counted down to their date of expected return from overseas. At large base camps, soldiers typically lived in wooden or sandbagged structures known as hooches, or in barracks-style buildings with corrugated metal roofs that amplified the sound of tropical rain but offered protection from the elements. In smaller fire bases and forward positions, troops often slept in tents, bunkers, or foxholes protected by sandbags and earthen berms that could absorb shrapnel and small arms fire. Fire support bases established from 1966 onward usually included artillery positions, a battalion or company command post, a medical aid station, and basic living quarters clustered together within a defensive perimeter ringed with wire and fighting positions. Field soldiers commonly slept in jungle hammocks or on ponchos laid on the ground when away from bases during multi-day operations that took them deep into enemy territory. Standard American Army combat dress in Vietnam included the OG-107 cotton fatigue uniform and later tropical combat uniforms with ripstop fabric designed to resist tearing in dense vegetation. Most soldiers wore steel M1 helmets in the field, sometimes switching to soft boonie hats during less intense operations when the weight and heat of the helmet became oppressive in the tropical climate. Standard individual weapons by 1966 through 1967 included the M16 rifle, the M60 machine gun at squad level, and the M79 grenade launcher for indirect fire against positions the riflemen could not engage directly. Soldiers on patrol typically carried a rucksack with extra ammunition, C-ration meals, water, a poncho, extra socks, and basic hygiene items needed to sustain themselves in the field for days at a time. Typical combat loads could exceed 25 to 30 kilograms, including weapon, ammunition, water, and protective gear that bent the soldier's back as he moved through the heat and humidity of the jungle. American rations in the field were mainly canned C-rations, providing about 3,600 calories per day in 3 meals designed for sustenance rather than pleasure. Each C-ration meal usually contained a canned meat item, a bread or dessert item, a fruit or beverage item, and an accessory packet with coffee, sugar, salt, gum, and cigarettes that soldiers traded among themselves according to personal preference. In more remote or long-range patrols, some units used lightweight freeze-dried rations instead of standard sea rations to reduce the weight they carried through difficult terrain. Soldiers at larger bases often ate hot meals from field kitchens when not in the field, including eggs, meat, and other cooked foods that reminded them of home. Potable water in the field was usually carried in canteens and resupplied by helicopter or water trailers. Purification tablets were also issued for use with local water sources when resupply was delayed or conditions prevented helicopter landing. Helicopters such as the UH-1 Huey were used to move troops, deliver supplies, evacuate casualties, and transport mail to field units, becoming the workhorses that kept the American war machine functioning across the difficult terrain of mountains, jungles, and rice paddies. At battalion and brigade bases, soldiers had periodic access to showers, laundry services, and barber facilities, improving hygiene compared with field conditions where cleanliness was difficult to maintain. In jungle operations, soldiers frequently dealt with heat, humidity, rain, insects, and mud, which could cause skin problems and foot issues that disabled men as surely as enemy fire. Routine daily tasks in the field included guard duty, perimeter maintenance, digging or improving fighting positions, and equipment cleaning that prevented rust and malfunction in the humid climate. When not on operations, units conducted training, weapons maintenance, physical conditioning, and rehearsals for upcoming missions that might come at any time. Infantry units typically rotated between periods of field operations and stand-down days or short stays at larger bases for rest and refit. Stand-downs allowed soldiers to clean equipment, receive medical and dental care, attend briefings, and relax with movies or unit activities that offered brief respite from the constant stress of combat operations. Fire support bases and company positions maintained 24-hour security, including perimeter guards, listening posts positioned beyond the wire, and periodic night patrols that probed the darkness for enemy movement. Night routine at forward positions often included setting trip flares, claymore mines, and illumination rounds for artillery to use if enemy movement was detected approaching the perimeter. The darkness brought its own tensions, with every sound in the jungle potentially signaling an impending attack. Mail was the primary link between soldiers and families at home, letters and packages delivered through the military postal system that connected Vietnam to towns and cities across America. Mail delivery in field units was irregular due to operations and weather, making mail call a notable event when it occurred and a source of disappointment when it did not. Soldiers could send letters free or at low cost using APO and FPO addresses, relying on air and sea transport for delivery to loved ones waiting in the United States. Many bases hosted USO or Special Services shows featuring musicians, comedians, or actors visiting from the United States who brought entertainment and a connection to the world left behind. Base recreation facilities often included day rooms with radios, record players, ping pong tables, or paperback book exchanges where soldiers could find distraction during their limited free time. Larger rear bases sometimes had theaters showing films, small clubs serving soft drinks or beer, and sports fields for organized games that offered an outlet for energy and competition far from home. Military payment certificates were used instead of American dollars in Vietnam to control currency leakage and black market activity that could undermine the local economy. Soldiers were generally authorized 1 week of rest and recuperation leave outside Vietnam during their tour, with common destinations including Hawaii, Bangkok, Tokyo, and Sydney, where they could escape the war briefly. In-country passes sometimes allowed brief visits to nearby cities or recreation centers when operational tempo permitted such relief from the demands of duty. The Air Force used different tour policies, with many aircrew and support personnel serving 12-month tours, while some flying positions were defined by a set number of missions rather than calendar time. Tactical air and helicopter crews often lived at air bases with more permanent facilities, including mess halls, clubs, and more regular access to electricity than infantry in the field typically enjoyed. Medical care was organized in echelons, with medics and aid stations at unit level, evacuation hospitals in larger bases, and facilities in Japan or the United States for serious cases requiring specialized treatment beyond what could be provided in the combat zone. Infantry platoons typically consisted of about 20 to 40 soldiers organized into squads and led by a lieutenant and a platoon sergeant who shared responsibility for their men's welfare and combat effectiveness. Companies usually had 3 or 4 rifle platoons plus a weapons or headquarters element, forming the basic maneuver unit in most operations. Artillery units at fire bases manned 105mm or 155mm howitzers in shifts around the clock, performing firing missions, maintenance, and ammunition handling that supported infantry operations across their sector. Standard personal protective equipment included flak vests, steel helmets, and sometimes insect repellent and mosquito nets in sleeping areas to protect against the malaria-carrying mosquitoes that plagued the region. Many soldiers supplemented issued gear with purchased items such as radios, cameras, or more comfortable boots sourced from post-exchange stores that stocked goods from home. The one-year rotation policy, combined with the draft's 2-year active duty obligation, meant that many enlisted soldiers spent roughly half their total service time in Vietnam. General Westmoreland supported the one-year tour on the grounds that harsh climate and conditions made longer tours difficult for morale and health. The rotation system created a constant turnover of personnel, with experienced soldiers departing just as they became most effective and new arrivals needing time to learn the ways of combat in this unfamiliar land. By 1967, American forces manned thousands of fire bases, outposts, and base camps across South Vietnam, each with its own routines shaped by terrain, mission, and the possibility of contact with an elusive enemy who chose the time and place of engagement. From I Corps to the Mekong Delta, soldiers adapted to a war unlike any their fathers had fought, where front lines dissolved into a mosaic of territory that changed with the setting of the sun. Between 1965 and 1967, many rural districts of South Vietnam were officially classified as contested, with control shifting between government and insurgent influence depending on the time of day and the presence of armed forces. Large American and South Vietnamese operations, especially in the central and northern provinces, contributed to population movements from rural villages toward towns and cities where security seemed more certain. By the mid-1960s, Saigon and other major cities saw rapid growth of informal settlements as villagers moved in from war-affected countryside, seeking refuge from the fighting that had disrupted their lives. Internal displacement was tracked by South Vietnamese and American agencies, which produced refugee counts and established temporary camps and reception centers to handle the growing numbers. Some displaced families moved into government-organized resettlement areas, where they received basic shelter and limited assistance while waiting for conditions to improve in their home villages. Rural families sometimes relocated temporarily to market towns during periods of heavy fighting and returned to their fields when conditions allowed, their lives dictated by the rhythms of warfare rather than the seasons of planting and harvest. The war affected agricultural production in profound ways. Studies from this period estimate that South Vietnam's food output fell around the turning point of 1965 and 1966 due to reduced planted area and labor shortages that left fields fallow. Factors identified for declining rice output included insecurity in the fields, conscription into the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and into Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces alike, and employment in war-related construction that drew workers away from farming. In many rural areas, farmers adjusted their work schedules to cultivate and harvest crops early in the morning or late in the day to avoid military operations that might sweep through during other hours. Some villages experienced periodic restrictions on movement, such as curfews or bans on travel after dark, imposed by either government or insurgent forces, depending on who held sway in the area. Checkpoints staffed by South Vietnamese Army soldiers, national police, or regional forces were common on major roads, where civilians had their identity papers and cargo inspected before being allowed to continue. The South Vietnamese government used national identification cards and household registration records to track population movements and control urban access, creating a system of documentation that touched nearly every citizen. In Saigon, curfews were periodically imposed after coups, bombings, or political unrest, limiting nighttime movement for residents who otherwise tried to maintain normal lives. Markets in cities like Saigon, Hue, and Da Nang remained major centers for trade, with stalls selling food, clothing, and household goods, despite war conditions that sometimes brought the sound of artillery to the city's edge. The presence of American bases near cities boosted demand for services and goods, creating opportunities for local employment and small businesses that catered to soldiers with dollars to spend. Local contractors and workers were hired in significant numbers for base construction, transportation, and logistics related to American and South Vietnamese forces. The growth of American spending and military pay contributed to inflation and the development of a substantial urban black market where goods of every kind changed hands outside official channels. In rural pacification zones, revolutionary development teams and local officials organized hamlet meetings, work projects, and political education sessions designed to strengthen ties between villagers and the government in Saigon. Where security allowed, new or rebuilt schools, clinics, and roads were presented as evidence of government commitment to local welfare. School attendance in contested areas was often irregular, with classes disrupted by security incidents, troop movements, or damage to buildings caught in crossfire. Many rural children contributed to farm work or small trading activities, especially in families affected by loss of adult labor to military service or to the casualties of war. American civil affairs and medical teams periodically visited villages to provide vaccinations, basic treatment, and health education. Civic action programs sometimes distributed items such as clothing, cooking utensils, and agricultural tools to rural households as part of efforts to demonstrate that cooperation with the government brought tangible benefits. In areas near large bases, villagers often encountered American patrols and convoys on main roads and paths, adapting their daily routes to avoid traffic and checkpoints that could delay their journeys. Rural civilians might encounter multiple armed groups in the same area over time, including South Vietnamese Army units, regional forces, Viet Cong local forces, and main force North Vietnamese Army units passing through. Villagers frequently provided food, water, or directions to passing troops from either side, sometimes under pressure and sometimes simply to maintain working relations with all parties who might return. In some districts, local people attended official government meetings during the day and faced clandestine visits by Viet Cong cadres at night, navigating between competing authorities with care. Civil defense measures in towns included sandbagging of key buildings, construction of simple shelters, and instructions for residents on what to do during shelling or air raids. Air raid sirens were installed in larger cities to alert residents of incoming air attacks or rocket fire that could strike without warning. In coastal and riverine areas, fishing and boat transport continued but were subject to inspection by South Vietnamese and American naval or riverine forces patrolling the waterways. Some boat owners needed special permits or passes to operate in waterways designated as sensitive security zones. Urban bombings and attacks, such as those on Saigon's restaurants or hotels, led to increased security checks at public venues where soldiers and civilians gathered. City residents adjusted to occasional traffic disruptions and security sweeps after such incidents, including vehicle searches and identity checks that became part of daily life. The Chu Hoi Defector Program encouraged civilians with ties to the Viet Cong to surrender, offering resettlement and modest support in exchange for leaving the insurgency. Some former insurgents under Chu Hoi were employed as guides or informants for pacification teams operating in rural areas. In contested rural zones, night travel by civilians was generally limited, both by fear of ambush and by official curfew regulations that restricted movement after dark. Many villages maintained local watch groups or self-defense forces, partly as a response to both banditry and insurgent activity that threatened their security. Markets in contested areas sometimes operated only during certain hours of the day to reduce exposure to fighting or armed patrols. Some rural households diversified income sources, combining farming with small trade, craft work, or wage labor connected to military installations. Road and bridge damage from military operations often forced civilians to use alternate footpaths, ferries, or informal transport to reach markets and towns. Bus and truck services in many provinces operated intermittently, subject to road security, checkpoints, and occasional interdiction by Viet Cong forces. In some regions, farmers paid informal levies or taxes to both government officials and Viet Cong cadres, reflecting dual systems of authority that extracted resources from the same population. Land ownership patterns in the South remained unequal, with studies noting only modest changes in land inequality indicators between the mid-1950s and mid-1960s. Government-sponsored agricultural credit and cooperative schemes reached some rural districts, though coverage remained limited during this period of escalating conflict. Urban residents in Saigon, Hue, and Da Nang experienced both normal commercial life and periodic reminders of the war, such as troop convoys and security alerts that interrupted daily routines. Newspapers and radio broadcasts in South Vietnam reported daily war news, casualty figures, and government statements, shaping how civilians understood the conflict unfolding around them. The information that reached ordinary people was filtered through multiple layers of censorship and propaganda from various sources, leaving many uncertain about the true state of the war and their own prospects for a peaceful future. By 1967, American and South Vietnamese reports recognized that civilian displacement, economic disruption, and security measures had significantly altered everyday life in many parts of South Vietnam, creating a society caught between two armed camps. Villages that had known generations of relative stability now faced constant uncertainty, their residents calculating each day how to navigate between the demands of the government and the presence of insurgent forces who moved through the shadows. The human cost of the war extended far beyond the battlefield, touching families who had never taken up arms but found their world transformed by the decisions of leaders in distant capitals and the movements of armies across their ancestral lands. Between 1965 and 1967, the Ho Chi Minh Trail evolved from a primarily footpath system into a multi-route network of roads, tracks, and pipelines supporting large-scale logistics for the war in the South. The trail ran mainly along the western side of the Truong Son Mountains, known to Westerners as the Annamite Range, threading through southern North Vietnam, eastern Laos, and parts of northeastern Cambodia. This corridor through some of the most rugged terrain in Southeast Asia had become the lifeline connecting the forces fighting in South Vietnam to their sources of supply in the north. Group 559, a North Vietnamese transportation command created in 1959, remained the main organization responsible for building, maintaining, and operating the trail. By April 1965, Group 559 had expanded to about 24,000 personnel, including truck battalions, bicycle units, boat units, engineers, and liaison stations that together formed a complex logistics network spanning hundreds of kilometers. In April 1965, General Phan Trong II assumed command of Group 559, overseeing the early large-scale expansion of the road network that would transform the trail from a collection of jungle paths into something approaching a military highway system. In 1967, Senior Colonel Dong Sai Nguyen took command of Group 559 and continued to enlarge and improve the trail system with characteristic determination. The organization's motto, reported in North Vietnamese sources, was simple and direct: build roads to advance, fight the enemy to travel. This phrase captured the dual nature of the work, where construction crews and soldiers faced both the challenges of the terrain and the constant threat of American air attacks. The trail network consisted of main routes, bypasses, feeder roads, footpaths, and waterways connecting supply points to infiltration corridors leading into South Vietnam. By the end of 1967, North Vietnamese sources report that approximately 2,959 kilometers of vehicle-capable roads had been completed along the trail system. This figure included about 275 kilometers of main roads, 576 kilometers of bypass roads, and roughly 450 kilometers of entry roads and storage area roads. American intelligence estimated that in 1965, about 4,500 North Vietnamese Army troops and 300 tons of supplies per month were infiltrated through Laos via the trail. These numbers would grow substantially in the years ahead as the network expanded and North Vietnamese logistics capabilities improved. Group 559 used a relay system of truck parks and way stations, with trucks typically driving only one segment between stations before loads were transferred to other vehicles. This system reduced the vulnerability of any single convoy and allowed damaged vehicles to be repaired while supplies continued forward. Camouflaged truck parks were often located several kilometers off main roads and stocked with fuel and spare parts to support relay operations. Fuel for trail operations was stored in dispersed, concealed depots with enough supplies at some sites for up to 25 trucks. Communication liaison stations, usually about 1 day's march apart, provided food, shelter, medical care, and guides to the next station for marching units making their way south. These stations formed a chain of support that allowed even infantry units to move through hundreds of kilometers of jungle in relatively good condition. In addition to trucks, Group 559 continued to rely on porters, pack animals, and specially modified bicycles to move supplies. A single load-bearing bicycle, often pushed rather than ridden along the narrow trails, could carry roughly 3 times the load a porter could manage. 2 dedicated bicycle transportation battalions were reported active on the trail by 1965, their riders guiding heavily laden bicycles through terrain where no vehicle could pass. Pack animals such as mules and ox-drawn carts were used extensively to carry loads where roads were poor or interdicted by bombing. In some jungle areas, elephants were employed as pack animals for particularly heavy loads that no other means could transport. Movement schedules were adjusted to environmental conditions, with trucks often driving at night or in poor weather to reduce detection from the air. Anti-aircraft observers along the route used lookouts and early warning signals to alert convoys to approaching aircraft, giving drivers time to seek cover. When aircraft were detected, truck drivers often pulled off onto alternate paths or concealed turnouts, sometimes waiting an hour or more before resuming travel once the danger had passed. Extensive camouflage was used throughout the trail system. Foliage was transplanted over roads to create a canopy that concealed movement from aerial observation. Tracks were kept narrow to minimize visible disturbance of jungle cover that might reveal the route to reconnaissance aircraft. Some bridges and stream crossings were built below the water surface to make them difficult to detect from the air, their presence known only to those who traveled the route. North Vietnamese sources claim that Group 559 camouflaged about 2,000 miles of an estimated 12,000 miles of trail routes, a massive undertaking that continued even as American bombing intensified. Storage areas were often dug into hillsides or concealed under dense canopy, with supplies distributed among many small caches rather than concentrated in large depots, vulnerable to air attack. In 1965, American air interdiction of the trail began to intensify under operations such as Barrel Roll and Steel Tiger in Laos. Operation Steel Tiger, initiated in April 1965, specifically targeted logistical routes in the southern Laotian panhandle used by the trail. From April to June 1966, American forces flew about 400 B-52 anti-infiltration sorties against the trail system in Laos. Operation Tiger Hound, launched on the 5th of December 1965, concentrated American airstrikes in southeastern Laos, adjacent to South Vietnam's I and II core tactical zones. In 1967, Navy and Air Force aircraft focused many sorties on Steel Tiger and Tiger Hound areas to impede traffic on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Despite heavy bombing, American assessments acknowledged that trail traffic was reduced but not stopped, as alternative routes and bypasses were quickly opened by engineering teams working through the night. North Vietnamese engineers rapidly repaired craters and damaged bridges, often using manual labor, timber reinforcements, and makeshift bridging. By 1966 and 1967, North Vietnam began constructing fuel pipelines in the Panhandle, although full extension into Laos and South Vietnam came slightly later. Early pipeline segments extended from the Vinh area through passes such as Mu Gia and Ban Raving toward key distribution points near Chipon in Laos. The pipelines used imported plastic pipes connected with metal couplings and Soviet-made pumps to move diesel, gasoline, and kerosene to forward areas. Different petroleum products could be pumped through the same line, separated by slugs of water mixed with detergent to prevent contamination. The 592nd Pipelaying Regiment was responsible for much of the pipeline construction and maintenance supporting trail operations. By 1967, the trail system included multiple entry points from North Vietnam into Laos, including routes through the Mu Gia, Ban Karai, and Ban Raving passes. In the Laotian Panhandle, the network branched toward South Vietnam's I and II Corps and toward northeastern Cambodia for routes into III Corps. Reports indicate that some segments of the trail within Cambodia were developed by 1967 as Sihanouk Trail extensions to bring supplies via Cambodian territory. Throughout this period, North Vietnamese planners treated the trail as a strategic supply route, integrating it into national-level logistics planning that sustained the war effort in the South. Group 559 coordinated with front commands in South Vietnam to schedule infiltration groups, balancing personnel, weapons, and food according to campaign plans that evolved as the war expanded. American intelligence agencies, including the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency, monitored truck counts, road construction, and storage activity, along the trail using aerial photography and signals intelligence gathered from multiple sources. Despite the massive bombing campaign, North Vietnam steadily increased the volume of men and materiel moved through the Ho Chi Minh Trail between 1965 and 1967. The trail had become an engineering marvel of sorts, a testament to human determination and organizational skill applied against overwhelming technological superiority. Every crater was filled, every destroyed bridge rebuilt, every new route mapped and camouflaged. The trucks rolled southward through the darkness, their drivers navigating by memory and instinct along roads that existed on no map held by their enemies. The trail would continue to grow, its tentacles reaching ever deeper into the south, sustaining the forces who waited in the jungles and villages for the supplies that kept their struggle alive. The logistics network represented something more than supply lines. It was Hanoi's commitment to a protracted war made physical, the means by which a nation divided would seek to become whole again. Each ton of rice, each crate of ammunition, each replacement soldier walking southward along those mountain paths carried with them the determination of a people who had waited decades for reunification and were prepared to wait longer still. The 1962 International Agreement on the Neutrality of Laos formally committed signatories, including North Vietnam and the United States, to respect Laotian neutrality and withdraw foreign forces from that small landlocked kingdom. The agreement was soon violated by multiple parties. North Vietnam kept an estimated 7,000 troops in Laos after 1962, while the United States began covert air operations that would grow into one of the heaviest bombing campaigns in history. The paper neutrality of Laos existed in diplomatic archives while armies and aircraft operated freely across its territory. North Vietnam continued using Laotian territory for the Ho Chi Minh Trail, treating it as the Truong Son strategic supply route linking North and South Vietnam. By 1965, large segments of the trail ran through southeastern Laos, where North Vietnamese units built roads, way stations, and depots under the jungle canopy. The mountains of eastern Laos offered concealment and terrain that favored the movement of supplies away from American observation. Operation Barrel Roll, begun in December 1964, was a covert American air campaign over northern and northeastern Laos against North Vietnamese Army and Pathet Lao targets. Barrel roll operations supported the Royal Lao Armed Forces and Central Intelligence Agency-backed Hmong and other tribal forces while also striking parts of the Northern Trail system. In April 1965, American strikes against the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the Laotian Panhandle were designated Operation Steel Tiger, conducted by the 2nd Air Division and later 7th Air Force with the stated goal of impeding the flow of men and supplies along the trail. American intelligence estimated that in 1965, about 4,500 North Vietnamese troops and 300 tons of materiel per month moved through Laos along the trail. From April to June 1966, American B-52 bombers flew about 400 anti-infiltration sorties over Laotian sections of the trail under Steel Tiger. Operation Tiger Hound, initiated on the 5th of December 1965, focused American airstrikes on a smaller area of southeastern Laos adjacent to South Vietnam. Barrel Roll and Steel Tiger together created a two-zone American air war in Laos. Barrel Roll in the north, supporting the ground war against communist forces, and Steel Tiger along with Tiger Hound in the southern panhandle, targeting the logistics network. North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao ground forces in Laos included several infantry regiments, artillery units, and Pathet Lao battalions engaged against Royal Lao and allied forces. The Royal Lao government publicly upheld neutrality, but in practice relied heavily on American air support and Central Intelligence Agency-directed irregular forces to combat communist advances. By mid-1966, North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao forces had seized positions such as Nam Bac, threatening key Royal Lao strongholds, but American air power helped slow their advances temporarily. At the time, Communist forces controlled roughly two-thirds of Laotian territory and about one-third of the population, similar to their gains by 1961. American operations in Laos remained formally covert, with the extent of bombing not publicly detailed in official statements during 1965 through 1967. The International Control Commission for Laos, charged with monitoring neutrality, had limited capacity and access, and could not halt violations by either side. North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao forces used Laotian border areas both to support operations in Laos and to stage units and logistics for South Vietnam. In northern Laos, barrel roll missions increasingly provided close air support to Royal Lao Army and Hmong forces engaged against communist troops. In the Laotian Panhandle, Steel Tiger and Tiger Hound strikes concentrated on roads, truck parks, river crossings, and storage areas along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Navy and Air Force aircraft flying Rolling Thunder missions over North Vietnam sometimes also conducted sorties against trail targets in Laos. Central Intelligence Agency and Defense Department reports noted that despite intensive bombing, North Vietnamese forces maintained and expanded the Laotian trail network through rapid repairs and bypass construction. The bombing caused damage but could not stop the southward flow of supplies. The 1962 Geneva neutrality of Cambodia, like that of Laos, was intended to keep the country outside the Vietnam conflict. Prince Norodom Sihanouk, Cambodia's head of state, pursued an official policy of neutrality while balancing relations with both Western and communist states. In 1965, Sihanouk broke diplomatic relations with the United States, citing mistrust and perceived interference in his country's affairs, and moved closer to China and North Vietnam. That year, Sihanouk agreed to allow North Vietnamese forces to establish bases and supply sites in sparsely populated Cambodian border areas where his government exercised little effective control. As American naval patrols under Operation Market Time made seaborne deliveries into South Vietnam more difficult, North Vietnam developed the Cambodian route to the port of Sihanoukville. In October 1965, an arrangement was made for communist-flagged ships to deliver military supplies from North Vietnam and China directly to the Cambodian port. This route, later called the Sihanouk Trail, allowed North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces to move supplies from Sihanoukville by road through Cambodia and into border sanctuaries adjoining South Vietnam's The Thur and IV Corps tactical zones. American and South Vietnamese intelligence became increasingly aware during 1966 and 1967 that enemy forces were using Cambodian territory as a logistics and troop sanctuary. By 1967, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces were operating from base areas just inside Cambodia along the borders with South Vietnam. Sihanouk publicly denied that Cambodia was serving as a base for Vietnamese communists, although American and South Vietnamese sources reported otherwise. International Control Commission investigations in the early 1960s had sometimes supported Cambodian claims that large-scale violations were not then occurring, but the situation evolved considerably as the war expanded. As North Vietnamese and Viet Cong use of Cambodian sanctuaries expanded, the Cambodian government faced internal tensions between Sihanouk and more pro-Western figures such as General Lon Nol. American and South Vietnamese forces carried out some covert or deniable cross-border ground incursions into Cambodia against suspected enemy sites before 1968. Though these actions were officially limited, Sihanouk publicly protested reported cross-border raids and airstrikes, asserting Cambodian neutrality and sovereignty in international forums. Despite protests, Cambodia's porous eastern border made full control of Vietnamese communist activities difficult for the government in Phnom Penh. Cambodian border regions such as Ratanakiri, Mondulkiri, and Svay Rieng hosted jungle-based areas where Vietnamese forces established supply dumps and rest camps. Laos and Cambodia both featured heavily forested, sparsely populated borderlands that North Vietnamese planners saw as ideal for covert routes and sanctuaries beyond the reach of conventional pursuit. American policy toward Cambodian sanctuaries in 1965 through 1967 remained cautious. Washington refrained from broad, overt bombing in Cambodia to avoid a wider diplomatic crisis that might draw additional powers into the conflict. American leaders hoped through the mid-1960s that Sihanouk might eventually moderate or reverse his stance, influencing the decision not to attack Sihanoukville directly. In Laos, American bombing and covert operations were justified publicly as supporting the neutralist government, though they also aimed at cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. North Vietnam, for its part, regarded use of Laotian and Cambodian territory as essential to sustain operations in South Vietnam while reducing exposure to direct attacks on its own territory. The strategic value of these neutral countries lay precisely in their status. So long as they remained officially outside the conflict, attacking them openly risked international condemnation and potential escalation that neither Washington nor Hanoi fully wanted to provoke. By the end of 1967, Laos and Cambodia, though formally neutral, had become integral to the wider conflict's logistics and maneuver space. Both governments continued to affirm neutrality in public statements, even as their territory hosted the infrastructure of war. The secret wars in Laos and the growing sanctuary system in Cambodia represented a shadow conflict parallel to the fighting in South Vietnam itself, hidden from public view, but essential to the strategies of all parties. The American bombing of Laos, though unreported at the time in official statements, was already becoming one of the most intensive air campaigns ever conducted. Villages along the trail routes lived under constant threat of air attack, their inhabitants caught between the demands of North Vietnamese transport units passing through and the bombs that fell without warning from the sky above. In Cambodia, the contradictions of Sihanouk's policy grew more apparent as the sanctuaries expanded and the war drew ever closer to his borders. These neutral nations had become battlegrounds in all but name, their sovereignty compromised by forces far more powerful than their governments could resist. The violations of their neutrality would have consequences extending far beyond immediate military calculations, setting in motion political transformations that would engulf both countries in the decade ahead. In 1965 through 1967, President Lyndon Johnson publicly described the American goal in Vietnam as helping South Vietnam resist communist aggression and preserve its independence. Johnson frequently framed the conflict within a broader containment strategy, stating that failure in Vietnam might encourage communist advances elsewhere in Asia, a domino effect that would ultimately threaten American interests around the world. His administration had inherited the commitment from Kennedy and expanded it into something far larger than anyone had anticipated. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy supported escalation in 1965, arguing that increased pressure on North Vietnam was needed to prevent a gradual but inevitable breakup of South Vietnam. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara initially backed troop increases and rolling thunder, believing that measured application of American power would bring Hanoi to the negotiating table. But by late 1966, McNamara began questioning the effectiveness of further escalation, his confidence shaken by reports from the field and analysis from his own staff. In an October 1966 memorandum, McNamara recommended stabilizing troop levels and reducing bombing of North Vietnam, suggesting that military measures alone could not achieve American objectives. The memo urged exploring a political settlement while maintaining enough military pressure to deter a complete communist victory. A June 1967 memorandum from McNamara to Johnson laid out alternative military actions against North Vietnam and reflected internal disagreement over bombing strategy that had grown increasingly bitter. In that 1967 memo, McNamara cited intelligence assessments that no level of air or naval action short of invasion was likely to force Hanoi to capitulate. Johnson ultimately rejected McNamara's proposals for major bombing cutbacks in 1967, preferring to continue Rolling Thunder with modifications rather than appear to weaken American resolve. Walt Rostow, who replaced Bundy as National Security Advisor in 1966, generally supported continued bombing and believed pressure could eventually change Hanoi's calculus. The Joint Chiefs of Staff repeatedly recommended stronger military measures, including expanded bombing and increased troop deployments beyond what the administration approved. Central Intelligence Agency and State Department analyses often took a more cautious view, doubting that bombing alone would significantly reduce infiltration or force political concessions from Hanoi. Publicly, Johnson and his senior advisors in 1965 through 1967 insisted that the United States was making progress in Vietnam despite acknowledging difficulties that seemed to multiply with each passing month. In private meetings, Johnson asked advisors whether the war was worth it and worried about domestic political costs, as recorded in later declassified transcripts. McNamara later recalled that by late 1967, he believed the United States should have considered withdrawal or a negotiated settlement earlier than it did, a judgment that came too late to alter the course he had helped set. In Hanoi, the Workers' Party of Vietnam, led by figures including Ho Chi Minh and First Secretary Le Duan, set overall strategy for the war. Hanoi's leadership publicly stated that its goal was the reunification of Vietnam under a socialist government and the expulsion of foreign forces. Internal documents show that Hanoi viewed the war as a long, protracted struggle in which political and military fronts were closely linked. A Politburo line from 1965 through 1967 described North Vietnam as the Great Rear Base and South Vietnam as the main battlefield for the People's War. In the mid-1960s, Le Duan advocated a more aggressive strategy in the South, arguing that American intervention would not fundamentally alter the long-term balance. North Vietnamese leaders expected that the United States, as an overseas power, would eventually face domestic constraints that North Vietnam, fighting on its own soil and in neighboring countries, would not. North Vietnamese public statements portrayed American bombing as proof of escalation, but stated that it would not force Hanoi to abandon its objectives. Hanoi's propaganda emphasized that North Vietnam could endure heavy bombing while continuing to support the Southern struggle. Internal analyses noted that American airstrikes caused damage but also led to increased foreign aid from China and the Soviet Union. Chinese leaders tended to encourage a more militant line, while Soviet leaders often urged some caution and sought to avoid direct superpower confrontation that might draw them into war with America. North Vietnamese decision-makers balanced Chinese and Soviet advice but maintained their own timetable for escalation, including reinforcement of army units in the south. Vietnamese communist sources describe three key strategic decisions in this era: to resist American escalation, to continue large-scale infiltration and to prepare for protracted conflict that might last years or even decades. In Saigon, political power from mid-1965 rested in a military leadership dominated by Generals Nguyen Van Thieu and Nguyen Cao Kai Paichi. In June 1965, a military council replaced civilian leaders and formed a national leadership committee with Thieu as chief of state and Cao as prime minister. American officials pressed South Vietnamese leaders to move toward constitutional government, leading to the drafting of a new constitution in 1966 and 1967. Johnson emphasized in meetings at Honolulu in February 1966 and Guam in March 1967 that Saigon needed a stable, legitimate government to sustain the war effort and maintain American public support. Thieu and Kai accepted American advice to hold elections, culminating in the September 1967 presidential election in which Thieu became president and Kai vice president. The 1967 Constitution created a presidency, a prime ministerial post, and a bicameral National Assembly, seeking to formalize institutions beyond military rule. American assessments in 1967 described the Thieu Key ticket as acceptable but not ideal, with some documents calling them the bottom of the barrel in leadership quality. South Vietnamese leaders publicly portrayed their war aim as defending the Republic of Vietnam against communist aggression and preserving a non-communist state. Saigon's leadership was concerned about maintaining American support while also asserting its sovereignty in areas such as pacification priorities and internal politics. Military Assistance Command Vietnam Commander General Westmoreland's strategy, supported by Thieu and Key, emphasized attrition of enemy forces through large unit operations while South Vietnamese forces increasingly handled pacification. Embassy and military reports in 1966 through 1967 frequently described progress in terms of enemy killed, hamlets secured, and army modernization, while also noting continuing political fragility that undermined these claims. In Washington, a growing hawk-dove division appeared by 1966 and 1967, with some lawmakers and officials advocating more aggressive action and others favoring negotiation and bombing halts. Senator J. William Fulbright, as chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, held widely publicized hearings in 1966 questioning administration policy and escalation. Public opinion polls during 1966 and 1967 showed declining confidence that the war was being won, even as a majority initially still favored continuing the effort. In Hanoi, leaders interpreted continued American escalation and domestic debate as evidence that their protracted war strategy was working. North Vietnamese sources state that leadership believed heavy casualties and destruction were acceptable if they led to eventual American withdrawal and national reunification. Saigon's leaders, in turn, worried that any sign of American wavering could undermine South Vietnamese morale and encourage defections. By the end of 1967, all three leadership centers were preparing for continued major operations, each side claiming progress but also recognizing significant costs and uncertainties. Central Intelligence Agency reporting in late 1967 noted that President Thieu planned to strengthen the presidency through a Secretariat General and advisory councils to centralize decision-making. South Vietnamese army and civilian leaders were aware of corruption and administrative weaknesses, but feared that aggressive anti-corruption campaigns could destabilize the government they were trying to build. Hanoi did not expect the 1968 American presidential election to quickly alter American policy, but considered domestic politics as one factor that might influence the war's outcome. The three capitals operated from different assumptions about time and cost. Washington measured progress in quarterly reports and body counts, seeking signs that the investment was producing results to sustain public support. Hanoi measured progress in years and generations, accepting sacrifice that would have been politically impossible for any American administration. Saigon existed between these two, dependent on American support, but aware such support might not last forever. The war had become a test of wills conducted across vast distances by leaders who had never met. What seemed rational in Washington appeared stubborn from Hanoi. What seemed patience in Hanoi appeared fanaticism from Washington. In Saigon, caught between these giants, leaders tried to chart a course that would preserve their country regardless of which way the great powers turned. As 1967 drew toward its close, the contours of a long war had become unmistakable. The escalation that had begun in 1964 and accelerated through 1965 had not produced the quick resolution that optimists in Washington had once hoped might be possible. Instead, both sides had dug into positions from which retreat seemed impossible and victory remained elusive. The war had taken on a momentum of its own, carrying all parties forward into a future none could clearly see. The American commitment had grown to proportions unimaginable just a few years earlier. Hundreds of thousands of troops occupied bases and fire bases across South Vietnam, supported by an air armada that dropped more bombs than had fallen in any previous conflict. Rolling Thunder had pounded North Vietnam for nearly 3 years without breaking Hanoi's will or stopping the flow of men and supplies southward along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Search and destroy operations had killed tens of thousands of enemy soldiers, yet the insurgency continued and the North Vietnamese army reinforced its presence in the south with each passing month. In Washington, President Johnson faced mounting criticism from both directions. Hawks demanded expanded bombing and fewer restrictions on military operations, arguing that victory was possible if only the administration would unleash the full power at its disposal. Doves questioned the entire enterprise, wondering whether South Vietnam was worth the cost in American lives and treasure, and whether the war could ever be won on terms acceptable to democratic society. The center that Johnson tried to hold grew narrower with each casualty report. Secretary of Defense McNamara's doubts had become an open secret within the administration. His memos questioning the effectiveness of bombing and the prospects for military victory circulated among officials who increasingly divided into camps. The Joint Chiefs pressed for escalation. Intelligence analysts offered cautious assessments, politicians calculated electoral consequences, and the war ground on consuming resources and lives at a rate that seemed sustainable only until one looked closely at the trends. In Hanoi, the leadership remained committed to the strategy of protracted war that had served them against the French. They had accepted that victory would not come quickly and that the cost would be measured in generations of sacrifice. American bombing had damaged their country and killed their people, but it had also brought increased aid from China and the Soviet Union, and it had not shaken the fundamental determination to reunify Vietnam under socialist leadership. The Workers' Party directed the war with a unity of purpose that Washington's fractured decision-making could not match. North Vietnamese calculations rested on a simple observation. The Americans had to win, while the Communists merely had to not lose. Time favored those fighting on their own soil for objectives they considered sacred. Domestic constraints would eventually limit what democratic governments could sustain. The anti-war movement growing in American cities and universities seemed to confirm what Hanoi's strategists had predicted from the beginning. In Saigon, The Thuki government struggled to build legitimacy while fighting for survival. The Constitution of 1967 had created institutions, and the elections had provided a veneer of democratic mandate. But real power remained concentrated in the hands of military officers whose primary skill was soldiering rather than governance. Corruption eroded public confidence. Administrative weakness undermined pacification efforts. And always there was the fear that American support might waver, leaving South Vietnam alone against an enemy that would never tire. The South Vietnamese armed forces had grown substantially with American training and equipment, but their effectiveness remained uneven. Some units fought well. Others existed mainly on paper or dissolved under pressure. The pacification programs that were supposed to extend government control and win rural hearts had produced statistics that looked impressive in briefings while leaving much of the countryside contested or under insurgent influence after dark. By late 1967, the war had become an institution with its own bureaucracies, its own rhythms, its own logic that defied the intentions of those who had set it in motion. Generals planned operations, diplomats explored contacts, journalists filed stories, protesters marched, soldiers fought and died, and the outcome remained as uncertain as it had been when the first Marines waded ashore at Da Nang. The attrition strategy that Westmoreland pursued rested on the assumption that killing enemy soldiers faster than they could be replaced would eventually break Hanoi's will. But the crossover point where communist losses exceeded replacements never seemed to arrive. Each month's body count was matched by new infiltration figures. Each victory was followed by continued resistance. The enemy refused to behave according to American models of rational cost-benefit analysis. Public opinion polls showed declining confidence that the war was being won, even as majorities still favored continuing the effort. The contradiction captured the American dilemma. Unwilling to accept defeat, unable to achieve victory, and uncertain how to escape the trap that Vietnam had become. Johnson's political advisors warned of consequences in the 1968 elections. His military advisors requested more troops. His intelligence advisors offered assessments that satisfied no one. The stage was set for a confrontation that would arrive early in 1968, though none in Washington, Hanoi, or Saigon knew exactly what form it would take. The Tet Offensive that lay ahead would shatter assumptions on all sides and transform the war in ways that the leaders of 1967 could not anticipate. But that story belongs to another chapter. For now, as the year ended, the soldiers in the field continued their patrols, the pilots flew their missions, the planners refined their strategies, and the diplomats searched for openings that might lead to negotiations. The war had become a presence in the lives of millions on both sides of the Pacific, a weight that could be felt even by those who never heard a shot fired in anger. It had divided families, ended careers, and reshaped societies in ways that would outlast the fighting itself. The long war that both sides had prepared for had indeed arrived. The statistics told part of the story. By year's end, American forces numbered nearly 500,000, supported by billions of dollars flowing through ports and airfields that had been jungled just 2 years before. Rolling Thunder had dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs without achieving its political objectives. Search and destroy operations had reported tens of thousands of enemy killed while the war continued unabated. But statistics could not capture the human dimensions. In villages across the South, farmers tried to grow rice while armies clashed around them. In hamlets deemed pacified by government metrics, people navigated between competing authorities. In American towns, families waited for letters from sons serving in a place most could not find on a map. In North Vietnamese homes, similar letters arrived, often carrying news no parent wished to receive. The war had created its own geography of sorrow. Da Nang and Cam Ranh Bay, Pleiku and Ia Drang, Cu Chi and the Iron Triangle, names that meant nothing to most Americans in 1964 had become markers of sacrifice. The Ho Chi Minh Trail wound through jungle and mountain, carrying determination southward, while American bombs tried to close a passage that refused to stay shut. At home in America, the war had become impossible to ignore. Television brought combat images into living rooms. College campuses debated the morality of intervention. Churches divided over questions of conscience. The draft hung over young men who had to decide whether to serve, resist, or find exemptions. The American system worked as designed: debates in Congress, protests in streets, editorials in newspapers, but democracy could not easily reverse a commitment made by presidents and endorsed by majorities. The war continued because stopping seemed harder than continuing, because admitting failure seemed worse than hoping for success that always seemed just ahead. In Hanoi, leadership watched American debate without illusion. They knew protests alone would not force withdrawal. They knew the war would continue until costs became unbearable for one side. They had calculated they could bear costs. America could not, and nothing in 1967 changed that calculation. The socialist camp provided enough support to continue fighting. The people accepted enough sacrifice to continue resisting. The stage was set for a confrontation that would arrive early in 1968. The Tet Offensive that lay ahead would shatter assumptions and transform the war in ways the leaders of 1967 could not anticipate. But that story belongs to another chapter. For now, as the year ended, soldiers continued their patrols, pilots flew their missions, and diplomats searched for openings. The war had become a presence in millions of lives, a weight felt even by those who never heard a shot fired. Rest now and let these events settle into memory. The story continues, but for the moment, there is peace enough for sleep.